This is the story of Daniel Hargrove and his wife, Claire Hargrove. They had been married for 9 years when Claire was admitted to Meredith General with a hemorrhagic stroke at 34, young enough that the doctors said it twice, as if repetition might make it make sense. Daniel sat in the waiting room with his hands folded in his lap, not praying exactly, but performing the posture of it. What he could not have known in those first hours was that Claire's mother, Rosemary Falk, had been carrying something for 3 years. Not grief, not worry, but a specific kind of guilt that had finally found its moment. The marriage had not been failing in any dramatic way. It had been dissolving the way salt dissolves in warm water, invisibly, completely, leaving behind only a faint change in taste that you notice only after you've already swallowed. The morning of the stroke had been ordinary in every way that matters. Daniel had made coffee. Claire had stood at the bathroom mirror with a mascara wand in one hand and her phone in the other, reading something that made her smile. Not at him, not at anything in the room, but at the small glowing rectangle that had become, over the past 2 years, a more consistent source of her amusement than he was. He noticed it the way you notice a draft in a house you've lived in long enough. You stop looking for the source. "You're going to be late," he said, setting her mug on the counter beside her. "I know." She didn't look up. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, not waiting for anything specific, just occupying the space between them in a way that had once felt comfortable and now felt vaguely ceremonial, like standing at a grave you visit out of habit rather than grief. They had been the kind of couple that other people described as solid, not passionate, solid. The word their friends reached for at dinner parties, the word their families used when they announced the pregnancy that didn't survive the first trimester 4 years ago. They're solid, those two, Daniel and Claire, as if solidity were its own kind of love, which perhaps it was. Or perhaps it was only what love looked like when it was resting and hadn't been asked to do anything difficult in a while. Daniel was an architect, not the glamorous kind. He designed municipal buildings, libraries, a few schools, structures meant to last and to be used without being noticed. He was good at his work in the way quiet people are good at things, steadily, without announcement. Claire was a marketing consultant for a firm that worked with mid-sized hospitality brands. She was good at it in the opposite way. She was brilliant at surfaces, at the language of desirability, at making things appear to be worth wanting. He had always admired this about her. He had also, quietly and without ever finding the right words, come to feel faintly excluded by it. They had a house in a neighborhood with old trees, a dog named Fern who was getting older and slept more than she used to, a standing Friday dinner reservation at an Italian restaurant where the owner knew their names. These were the architecture of their life together, functional, considered, easy to point to. The secondary character arrived in their lives 3 years before the hospital. Though Daniel hadn't thought of Marcus Webb in those terms at the time, Marcus was Claire's colleague, brought in as a creative director when her firm expanded. He was the sort of man who wore his charm lightly, as if he weren't aware of it, which was its own kind of expertise. Daniel had met him at a company event, shaken his hand, had a conversation about renovation trends and boutique hotels. He'd come away thinking Marcus was pleasant, intelligent, the kind of person Claire would like working with. He had been right about that last part. The three of them had dinner once, the autumn before everything. Claire had suggested it. "Marcus is interesting, you'd like him." And Daniel had agreed without curiosity. Over pasta and a bottle of Barolo, Marcus had been attentive to Claire in a way that Daniel registered only as professional warmth, leaning in when she talked, laughing a half-second before the punchline, the small performance of a man who finds someone genuinely compelling. Daniel had not felt alarmed. He had felt, if he was honest with himself later, faintly relieved that someone was giving her what he increasingly suspected he wasn't. What a quiet, devastating thing to admit. That was the hairline crack. Not the dinners that followed, not the late nights, not the phone she smiled at. All of that came after. The crack was that evening, the way Daniel had sat across from his wife, while another man paid her the kind of attention she had stopped expecting from her husband, and he had felt relief, as though the pressure had been redistributed, the weight shared, and wasn't that a reasonable accommodation to make? He thought about that dinner in the hospital waiting room 8 months later, while Claire was unconscious in a room he wasn't allowed to enter yet. The small disturbing thing about ordinary mornings is how precisely you remember them afterward. The distance had not come all at once. That's the thing about slow erosion. It's only visible in photographs, in the before and after, never in the middle where you're standing. 6 months before the hospital, Daniel had started staying later at the office, not because the work required it, but because the office had a kind of uncomplicated quiet that the house had stopped offering. He would sit at his drafting table after everyone else had gone and make adjustments to drawings that didn't need adjusting, and he would feel, in the particular silence of a building with no one in it, something close to peace. Claire noticed. She didn't ask about it directly. Instead, she became more efficient in her speech with him. Shorter sentences, questions that were really schedules, conversations that were really logistics. There's food in the fridge. Fern's appointment is Thursday. My mother's coming for the weekend, just so you know. She stopped telling him stories from her day, those mid-length narratives about impossible clients and office politics that had once been their primary currency of intimacy. And he hadn't asked where they'd gone. He told himself she was busy. She told herself he wasn't interested. They were both right and both wrong, which is the condition most long marriages exist in. Rosemary Falk visited for that weekend in March, and Daniel had watched his mother-in-law watch her daughter across the dinner table in a way that troubled him without his being able to name why. Rosemary was a careful woman, not cold but precise. She had married late, lost Claire's father to a cardiac event when Claire was 19, and had spent the years since developing the particular self-sufficiency of a woman who'd had the structure of her life removed and rebuilt it herself, board by board. Daniel respected her. He also found her slightly unreadable, which Claire had once said was a family trait. That evening, Rosemary had asked, over wine, "How are you two doing?" The actually hung in the air. "We're fine," Claire said without looking up from her glass. Daniel said busy, but good. Rosemary had nodded slowly, looking at neither of them specifically, and said, "That's a careful pair of answers." The conversation moved on, but the observation had landed somewhere in Daniel's chest and stayed there, small and cold as a stone in still water. The internal reality was that Daniel had started to feel he had no better word for it, peripheral. Not unloved, not mistreated, but beside the point of his wife's inner life. She existed in a register he couldn't access. Her laughter happened elsewhere. Her frustrations arrived at home already processed, the emotion drained out of them, as if she'd worked through the difficult part somewhere he wasn't. He had begun to understand that intimacy was not the same thing as cohabitation, which is perhaps the most adult and devastating lesson a marriage can teach. One evening in April, he had come home to find her on the back porch, phone to her ear, laughing. He heard the laugh before he saw her through the glass, full, unguarded. The laugh she used to give him when they were first together, and everything he said felt witty to her by virtue of her affection. He had stood in the kitchen holding his keys for a long moment, not wanting to interrupt, not wanting to see who she was talking to, not wanting to know or not know. He'd gone upstairs and washed his hands for longer than necessary. The discovery, when it came, was not dramatic in the way he might have imagined. It was a Tuesday. He had picked up her phone to check a restaurant address she'd asked him to, call from the bedroom while he was nearest the counter, and in the 3 seconds it took to navigate to her Maps application, he had seen a message thread preview, not the contents, just the name, and a string of recent timestamps: 11 p.m., 12:30 a.m., 1:15 a.m., 1:15 a.m., running back into the preceding weeks like a second calendar she'd been keeping. He'd found the address, given it to her, said nothing. He had sat with this knowledge for 2 days, not because he was planning anything, but because some part of him needed to understand what he actually felt before he did anything with it. What he found beneath the shock, beneath the expected contraction in his chest, was something complicated and almost embarrassing in its honesty. He was not entirely surprised, and not being surprised felt, in its own way, like the worst part. He waited until a Sunday, which was when they had historically done their most honest talking. Something about the unhurried quality of Sunday mornings, the coffee and newspapers, and Fern's heavy head on someone's feet had always made directness easier between them. He said, I saw the messages, or I saw the name and the timestamps. Claire was standing at the kitchen window. She had her mug held in both hands, and she turned to look at him with an expression he hadn't expected. Not fear, not guilt in the hot burning form, but something more like the face of someone who has been waiting in a waiting room and finally heard their name called. Okay, she said. He didn't raise his voice. He hadn't planned a speech. What he said came out the way things do when they've been sitting quietly long enough. I want to understand. I'm not asking so I can catalog it. I want to understand what happened. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, it was with the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed this and hated how rehearsed it sounded. You weren't here. And I don't mean it as an accusation. I know that's how it sounds. But I mean it as a fact. You stopped being here. And I didn't know how to tell you because I wasn't sure you'd care enough to fix it. And that uncertainty was worse than the absence. You could have told me. I tried, Daniel, in the ways I know how to try, which maybe aren't very loud. But I tried. He sat with this. The trying she meant was probably real, the way she described it, the shortened conversations, the efficiency, the withdrawal of the stories she used to tell him. He had noticed all of it and interpreted it as disinterest rather than injury. This was a failure of reading, and he wasn't entirely sure whose. And Marcus? He said. Not angrily, just the name. She looked at her coffee. It was what it was. I'm not going to tell you it was nothing, because you're not an idiot, and neither am I. She paused. I don't think I was looking for something to destroy us. I think I was looking for something to feel like myself in. That's not a justification. It's just what happened. The psychologically precise thing about that statement was that it was entirely believable and entirely insufficient at the same time. He understood her. He could see the mechanics of it, how a person arrives at that particular door. Understanding did not mean he could stay. I need some time, he said. Not time to decide whether to be angry. I already am. But time to. He stopped. I need to be somewhere that I'm not trying to figure out what's real. He moved to his sister's house the following week. Not with anger, not with theatrical badpacking. He simply said he needed 3 or 4 weeks, maybe more. And Claire did not argue, which told him something about how exhausted they both were, how the relationship had already been grieving itself quietly before this. He was still at his sister's house when Claire's mother called him about the hospital. Rosemary was in the waiting room when he arrived. She looked older than she had in March. Grief does that. Not the grief of loss exactly, but the grief of clarity, of seeing something you'd looked away from for too long. She stood when she saw him, not with relief, but with a determined kind of resolution, the look of someone who has made a decision and needs to make it before they lose their nerve. She's stable, she said. They're not letting anyone in yet. He sat beside her. They didn't speak for several minutes, the way people don't when the situation has used up the language available to ordinary moments. Then Rosemary said, I need to show you some things. I've been carrying them, and I shouldn't be the one still carrying them. She had Claire's tablet. She'd known the passcode for years, had set it up for Claire once when Claire's hands were occupied with grocery bags, and Claire had never changed it. Rosemary navigated with the practiced grief of someone who had already looked at everything she was about to show him. What Daniel saw over the next 40 minutes was not just the continuation of what he'd already suspected. It was the longer history, messages going back not 3 months but 18. A careful parallel architecture of attention and confidence that Marcus had been building while Daniel had been designing libraries. More than that, conversations in which Claire had said things about her marriage with a candor she'd never offered the marriage itself. He's not unhappy, he's just absent. I don't think he knows how to want things anymore. And beneath that thread, something Rosemary scrolled to with visible reluctance. An older conversation, predating Marcus from 2 years before the stroke, a man Daniel didn't recognize, briefer, and then stopped. Daniel looked at Rosemary. I knew, she said. About the first one. I found out. She confided in me, actually. I thought I was helping by keeping it private, by letting her handle it. I told myself she was going through something and that it would pass, and that involving you would only damage something that could be saved without damage. She pressed her lips together. I was wrong. I told myself I was protecting my daughter. But I was protecting my own idea of her. There's a difference. This was the most honest thing Daniel had ever heard Rosemary say. It arrived with the particular weight of a confession that has been waiting for years for its proper moment. He handed the tablet back. His hands were steady. In the months between the separation and the hospital, Daniel had done something he hadn't expected. He had started to feel better, not happily, not without grief. But there was a kind of returning to himself that happened when he stopped spending his energy trying to close the gap between himself and Claire. He slept more. He worked on a project he cared about. He took Fern on longer walks, having negotiated her custody with Claire in the quiet way they negotiated most things now, practically, without theater. He had not stopped loving Claire. That was the complication no one warned you about. You could understand exactly why something ended. You could see the whole mechanism of it clearly, and still carry a real tenderness for the person it was with. Love and the marriage were not the same thing. The marriage had become something neither of them could live well inside of. The love was just still there, dimmer, patient, beside the point. Rosemary sat beside him, and they waited together. Claire was moved to a recovery room on the third day. The stroke had been caught early enough. There would be some rehabilitation. Her left hand had lost precision. Her speech was slightly slower than it had been, but she was expected to recover substantially. The doctor said remarkable once, and Daniel thought, she has always been remarkable. That was never the problem. He went in when they said he could. She was propped against pillows, the afternoon light coming in at a low angle across the bed. She looked reduced in the hospital way. Not small, exactly, but stripped of the particular performance of self that people carry through ordinary days. She looked, he thought, like herself, at 22, before they'd learned each other's defenses. Hey, she said. The word came out slightly softly. The speech therapist's exercises still new. Hey. He sat in the chair beside the bed. Close enough to be present, not so close as to promise something. For a while they were quiet. It wasn't uncomfortable. It had the texture of two people who have said the most important things and are now sitting with the space those words left. My mother talked to you, Claire said. It was not quite a question. Yes. She looked at the window. I figured she would. Eventually. There was no bitterness in it, just the recognition of something long inevitable. Are you angry with her? He asked. Claire considered this with the slowness that was partly the stroke's doing and partly just hers. She had always thought carefully, even when her conclusions were wrong. No, she said. I think I'm relieved, actually. I'm tired of being the person all those things happened around. All that, she paused, choosing maintenance. I'm tired. Daniel nodded. I know it doesn't fix anything, she said. No, he agreed. It doesn't. This was the closest either of them came to a confrontation, and it didn't feel like one. It felt like two people standing at the edge of something that had already ended, not arguing about whether it was over, but acknowledging together the specific shape of the ending. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Not as a husband working toward reconciliation. He was not, but as someone who had loved her for 9 years and did not know how to simply stop appearing. He brought her things she needed. He talked with the doctors. When Rosemary arrived midweek, the three of them sat in the room with a complicated ease. The ease of people who have stopped pretending. What Daniel carried with him out of those hospital days and into the long months that followed was not bitterness. He had expected bitterness, and it hadn't come, or had come and passed so quickly it barely left a mark. What remained was something more like an education, not in betrayal, which he'd understood in the abstract, but in the particular way love can fail quietly, without malice, through an accumulation of small abdications that neither person names until it is too late to repair. He had abdicated too. That was the thing Rosemary's confession had clarified without meaning to. Claire's distance had been a response to something. His relief that evening at dinner 3 years ago, when Marcus had paid her the attention Daniel had stopped paying. That relief had been its own kind of abandonment. He had handed her an absence, and she had filled it, badly, in the way people fill things when they are lonely and have stopped believing they deserve more careful tending. He moved back to the house after Claire was discharged, not with her, but with the understanding that it needed to be sold, and that neither of them should have to navigate that alone. She stayed in the guest room. He stayed in the room that had been theirs. Fern slept wherever she wanted, indifferent to the geography of what had changed. One evening, he came downstairs to find Claire sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, her left hand resting in her lap in the particular way it had adopted since the stroke. She was looking out at the backyard, the old oak they'd argued about planting because it would eventually be enormous and outlast them, and had planted anyway. He sat across from her. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. After a while, she said, "I think I spent a long time confusing being wanted with being loved." He considered the distinction. It was precise, and it was hers, and it cost her something to say it. "Yeah," he said. "I think I spent a long time thinking presence was enough." The tree stood in the yard in the dark. They had named the problem, finally and fully, and too late to matter to the marriage. And there was a strange clean sadness in that. In understanding a thing, you can no longer use the understanding to fix. The house would sell in the spring. They would go to their separate places, carrying what they'd learned, which would be useful to them and useless to each other. That's the thing about understanding that arrives at the end. It doesn't save anything. It only tells you, clearly and without comfort, why the thing was always going to go the way it went, and leaves you to sit with that, quietly, in a kitchen that will soon belong to someone else. Beside a person you loved, watching something that will outlive you both hold its shape in the dark.